So let's look at doing something that a lot of other core JavaScript modules inside Node also do. Let's look at inheriting from the event emitter. There are a number of ways to set up the prototype chain in JavaScript, that is, inheritance in JavaScript. We've seen function constructors where the .prototype property of the function is what all objects created from that function constructor point to as their prototype. There are ES6 classes and a keyword called extends. And we've seen object.create. Within util.js, the util.js file, that module inside the Node.js source code, there's something to help us with inheritance. It's a method called inherits, and it takes two constructors. A function constructor upon which you want to add new methods and properties to be available to objects created with it, and another constructor where that's where the properties and methods you want to be added on to your objects, made available to your objects, are sitting. And essentially what it does is use these same concepts we've already seen within JavaScript to help us more easily make the methods and properties on the prototype property of this constructor available along the prototype chain for objects created with this constructor. First, it does a bit of error handling and checks to make sure that each of those functions are function constructors and have a proper prototype set up. And then here's where it gets interesting. The constructor that we want to add on to, we look at its prototype property. Now notice this is being set equal. So if you call inherits after you've set up some methods and properties on this .prototype property, you will actually override them. So you need to do this first before you add any other methods and properties to your prototype. Now, the constructor then has its prototype property, and that's set equal to object.create, meaning creating a new empty object, with the super constructors, or the constructor we're looking to get some properties and methods from, off its prototype property. So an empty object whose prototype is this prototype property of that function constructor. And that empty object, which just created a chain down to this prototype object, will be the prototype property of that function constructor, which means any objects created from this function constructor will end up at the top of this prototype chain that involves both this property and this property. All right, it looks a little confusing. Let's look at it visually. So let's say we have an object that has some properties and methods that I want to have access to. And I have my own object, which has its own properties and methods, and that's the one that I want to give it access to these other ones. So it has some prop 3, and I want to give it access to prop 1 and prop 2. What Node's inherits function does, using function constructors and object.create, is it simply places a prototype object in between the two. It creates a brand new prototype chain. So it takes the object that we have and says, well, your prototype, that object that I already have and I need to have more features added to it, it says, well, your prototype will have its prototype be the thing that you're actually looking to add on. And because of the way the prototype chain works, I will then have access to those properties and methods a little ways further down the chain. So it just sets up that middleman object, which then gives me access down the chain to the other properties and methods that I want. So object 1 will now have access to the properties and methods on object 2 by means of using object.create, which created that empty middle prototype object. And so we just have a plug in there to plug and connect those two objects down the prototype chain. And so now I have object 1, which has access to both the properties and methods that I wanted originally, plus the extra ones that I also want to be added to it. All right, let's see this practically by inheriting from the event emitter. I have an empty app.js file, and I'm first of all going to go out and use the require function to get a couple of core modules. So I'll get the event emitter, which is a function constructor, and the util library. Now, I'll create my own function constructor, and it will just have a single property that we add to any objects created from it, called greeting. And then I'll use util.inherits that we just saw. I'll say that any objects created from greeter should also have access to the methods and properties on the prototype property of event emitter. So essentially, any new objects I create from greeter will also get all the event emitter methods and properties. And I can still add my own extra methods and properties after the fact. So let's say I want to log the greeting. But because I will have access, my objects that I'm creating will have access to both the greeter methods and properties and the event emitter's methods and properties, I could do something like emit. I'll just use a string, even though it's a magic string. I'll just use a normal string here for simplicity. So I could then have this greet method that logs and emits. And emit is coming from the fact that greeter is also an event emitter. Then I can now create my new object, my new greeter object, let's say. And because this has both access to the properties and methods of greeter and event emitter, I can say on. And then on greet, I'll console.log someone greeted. And then I'll greet. So what's going to happen? Well, when I call greet, it will look for it. It won't be on this greeter object, but it will be on the prototype. And there's a greet method. So it will log it and then emit it. It won't find the emit method on greeter on this prototype, but it will find it a couple of steps down the prototype chain because we've added event emitters to our prototype chain. The prototype property of event emitter, to be completely accurate. And also the same thing with .on. It will go down the prototype chain and find the on method that is sitting on the .prototype property of event emitter. So I can use both emit and on. So now I have an object that has access to all of those properties and methods. And when I run this, there it is. Console.logged and the event worked. My function that I added with the .on ran after the event was emitted. So take a good look at this. This line gave me access with any objects that I created using a new greeter, as this first parameter, to all of the events, emitters, properties, and methods as if I had created the object saying new event emitter. Oh, by the way, you might be asking yourself, what if I want to pass some data to the event listeners? What if I wanted this function to get a parameter and give it something when the event is emitted? Well, the node event emitter comes with that feature. So let's say the greet function on my greeter, I wanted to pass it something when I invoke it. And here I'll just do a colon and a space and output it to the console. Now I emit the event, and if I want to pass this data to all my listeners, to all the functions in that array that will be invoked, I can simply say, after the event name in the emit method, the list of parameters that I want to give. And the emit method, that function, when it rolls through all those functions in the array, it will pass these parameters to the function. So in my listener, I just have to expect it. And then let's say I output this to the console too. And then I'll actually call greet and give it the name Tony. So this function will be invoked. I should see the greeting plus a colon, then Tony. And then I'll emit the event, but give the event some data. And then this function, the listener, will be invoked by the emit method, and it will pass that parameter to it. So I should also see someone greeted and then the data. So we can give it a try. Go to the command line, say node app.js, and there we go. Hello world, the data, and then the event listener was invoked and also got the data. So that's useful. And really, in general, that's available now because my greeter inherits from event emitter. So it has emit, it has on, and all the features event emitter has. So this is great. What does this look like? Well, we had this object. It's sitting on the prototype property of the event emitter function constructor. So any objects created from that event emitter function constructor will point at this object as their prototype. And it has some methods on it, some features that we want, like on and emit. But we don't want to just create an event emitter. We want to create another object that does more than what the event emitter does, but also does what the event emitter does. So we used util.inherits, which essentially said, I'll take this other type of object that does other things that you want, and its .prototype property will have as its prototype the event emitter's prototype property. So it set up a small prototype chain. And then when we said new greeter, that's what we get. Greeter1 points to that greeter.prototype object, and greeter.prototype points to the event emitter.prototype object. And the greeter itself had a greet method. And so that's our prototype chain. My new object, down its chain, finds the greeter prototype object, and down that chain it finds the event emitter prototype object, which means I can call .on, .emit, and .greet on my object at the top of the chain. This concept, then, of essentially be able to create new objects that have a combination of the functionality of one object and another object, you'll find all over inside the Node.js JavaScript core. And very often, the objects are inheriting from the event emitter. There are many event emitters inside Node.js that you can listen for events, you can emit events, but they're actually more than just an event emitter by themselves. All right, just understanding this concept, then, that we might have an object, a type of object in Node, that both does many things and emits and allows you to listen for events, is a key concept with Node. And as we move on, we're going to see other objects, key objects in building software applications in Node that allow you to listen for and emit events because they have the event emitter down their prototype chain. That is to say, many objects built into Node are a type of event emitter. They emit events, and you can listen for them, run code when a particular event happens. All right, so if we keep this in mind, we're ready to move on to continue to dive in to various core concepts within Node.js.